Hallo. That's as much German as I'm doing today. All right. I'm going to let this sink in for y'all here. Just soak this in. We shall call him Von Vapor. So this guy, he's the boss, right? He calls up his team and he says, "Great news. We just got the green light to redesign the homepage," right? Yeah, everybody and the team's there. They're like, "Oh, that's great news," right? "Great news, boss," right? "Yeah, the current homepage is super ugly," right? "And don't even ask about the code quality, lol, haha," right? "Yeah, we're going to get a chance to do it right this time," right? "We're going to be using BEM," right? "All the visuals would be clean and flat," right? "We're definitely going to be looking into that whole React thing we've been hearing about," right? "Maybe we'll even use this as an opportunity to migrate to a new CMS. Grunt," right? Von Vapor says, "Make it so." Gives the team the green light, right? And this is what we do, right? We get a chunk of budget, we get some time, and we do a project. And we lather, rinse, and repeat, and we end up with maybe not the most consistent experiences, right? This is Getty Images. I may have picked this example because I was looking for vaping businessmen. But, this is one example where they have a nice homepage, and then you start going through the experience, and you start seeing there's some holes in the continuity of the design. And as you click from page to, what the hell is that? I don't even know, right? And then this, and then this. And it's crazy. And this isn't all that uncommon, as I'm sure you all know, right? So we have scope issues that lead to these issues. We also have things like geography. This is Canon's website. This is their global homepage. And then you go to their North American homepage, and then their Latin American page. And then Chile apparently has their own page for some reason, because it's different than the other ones. We got Europe, India, Australia, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, right? So geography, playing it, sort of leads to these different experiences. And there's this guy. Maybe the biggest jerk of them all, right? Father Time, right? Huge jerk, right? So you have a site like eBay. You start off on the homepage in 2015, and then you click in, and then you go back to about 2007. You go back a little further, you end up in sort of 2004. And you click a little further, a little deeper, and you end up in 1999, right? It's like some Benjamin Button shit. Right. And then there's other issues. United, airline in the US, and let's take a look at their buttons. So appropriately, Edgar Winter Band's 1973 hit Frankenstein, 13 unique button styles on the homepage alone. That's crazy, right? So it's like all these big organizations, big enterprises, big global companies. Well, startups are sort of guilty too, right? It's like, we don't have time for cohesion and continuity. Yeah, we're too busy disrupting, right? We can't be bothered with this stuff. So this is the issue. People see you, your organization, your client's organization, as a single entity, right? They don't care that the designers and the developers are in two different continents, right? They don't care that you're using a node stack on one part of the site and PHP on another, right? They don't care if you're agile, right? Or anything like that. They see you as a singular entity. Right? And it's our job, our responsibility as designers and developers to make more products, more services, more content, more functionality, more features available to more mediums and more countries and more customers and more languages and locales, right? Across more browsers, more devices, more environments, more screen sizes, more form factors, more contexts. Good luck with that. See you later. Just kidding. Right? So, how do we manage to do this, right? How do we stay sane in this crazy multi-device era, whenever we're dealing with such big project scopes and disparate disciplines and all sorts of stuff. This is where style guides come in to help. There's actually a few different style guide types, and it's worth sort of going over all of them just to give you an idea of sort of how they all work together and what they all mean. So there's sort of 6 general flavors of style guides, and I'll sort of start with brand identity guidelines. Historically, these things have existed as like hardbound books, which are sort of weird, and they still exist to some degree. But more and more of these things are making their way online. This is West Virginia University's university in the United States. And you can see, they articulate, here's our logo, here's how you use it, here's how you space things, here's how not to use it, right? They have all these different people using their brand assets, so of course it's important for those things to remain consistent, right? Here's our tagline, here's fonts, here's our color palette, right? This is great, really fundamental stuff that should be wrangled and kept under one roof and available and accessible to anyone who's going to make use of those brand assets. There's a company called Frontify that I highly recommend checking out. It's sort of a brand style guide as a service sort of thing, which is great. But these brand style guides allow organizations and anybody working with those organizations to sort of, again, make use of these brand style guides so you don't have to constantly go tracking down a logo on Dropbox somewhere. Design language. So sort of sitting on a level above brand identity guidelines is this notion of a design language, right? Things like material design, which is sort of a hot topic these days, right? But you look at these things and it lays out these principles of, here's what we're trying to accomplish with our suite of projects, right? With our suite of products. Like, here's our design principles, here's some animation principles, here's some color principles, and here's some components that help make that stuff happen, right? Salesforce just released their Lightning design system, right? So these things are fantastic. It sort of establishes this consistent vocabulary, this design vocabulary for anyone who's using these products and services, anyone who's designing with them to all speak the same language. And again, it's at this layer above the brand level, so you could wipe out material design and still retain the overarching brand identity. Voice and tone is another kind of style guide that MailChimp has really done a great job at pioneering. So their voice and tone guidelines articulate how the brand should act, how they should communicate with their user whenever certain things happen, right? So this is, a success message. They just launched a campaign. It's like, congratulations, right? You did a great job. And MailChimp has this nice cheeky tone of voice, and so they are able to sort of celebrate with them, right? But then you might have other people who aren't yet customers, and maybe you want to strike a different tone with them. Or maybe their credit card just declined, or they just spammed 20,000 people, right? Maybe that sort of goofy monkey voice doesn't really make sense here, right? So articulating, laying out how to communicate with your users, especially with a company that's as big and fast-growing as MailChimp, wherever you have all these different people acting and communicating on behalf of the company, it's essential for them to all be speaking the same language. They just released this really massive content style guide, which is absolutely fantastic, very much worth your while going through to see how they're operating. So interface copy, marketing copy, documentation, blog posts, legal stuff, alerts, all that, right? Then we get writing style guides, and this is sort of one of the oldest forms of a style guide, right? The Chicago style and all this stuff. Laying out sort of rules around grammar and punctuation and things like that, right? Maybe you go with a standard comma, right? Bob, Sue, and Greg, right? Bob, comma, Sue, and Greg, without the comma between the second one. They came to my house, right? Or the Oxford comma, right? Bob, comma, Sue, comma, and Greg, they came to my house. My personal favorite, the walk-in comma. Bob, Sue, and Greg, they came to my house. Terrible. Sorry, I had to do it. But laying out sort of basic writing guidelines so that everyone who's contributing content for your organization is all sort of writing in this cohesive manner is fantastic. This is actually one of my favorite documents on the internet. This is a Canadian university, Dalhousie, and they have this just really quick page on what effective writing for the web looks like. And they sort of practice what they preach. They have nice headings and bulleted points and bolded text and stuff. Definitely recommend checking that out. Code guidelines, right? We've been seeing a lot of this over the last few years, things like SMACS and OCSS and BEM. Other things are trying to help us sort of write more modular, more maintainable code, right? And you as an organization, if you work on a team, you have to make a decision, right? Is this how we do it? 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 It's my new Morse code syntax, right? So this is important to talk about as a team, right? Because it's up to us to write consistent, cohesive code. If you hire new people, they should be able to get up and running very quickly. GitHub has a fantastic style guide that goes over their coding style for things like JavaScript and CSS and Ruby and stuff like that, right? So this allows teams to establish rules and guidelines and guardrails around how to actually write consistent code as a team so that some summer intern can't just come and screw everything up, right? Damn summer interns. And then there's pattern libraries. And this is sort of the thing that I'm most excited about. And pattern libraries are essentially these collections of your UI components, right? So this is Walmart's style guide, and so they're able to articulate, here's all of our navigation elements. Here's all of our flavors of buttons. Here's our drop-downs, right? Here's our icons, right? Here's a product tile. Here's our sidebar sort of filters and stuff like that, right? So these pattern libraries, which we'll dive into more, are there to sort of help articulate everything that goes into making up your user interface, right? And we'll talk about the benefits of that in a little bit. But anybody that's anybody that's working on the website can make use of this pattern library, right? And Anna Debenham and I had created a website called styleguides.io that rounds up a bunch of examples of these, articles about these things, tools. We even started podcasts, stuff like that. Okay, so collectively we have all of these style guides sort of working together as a unit. And I definitely encourage, if you're working in-house in an organization or you're doing client work, I do think that it's worth, surfacing these things, and if you already have them, really latch onto them and try to grow them and make them useful tools for everyone. So the question always comes up for me that people say, what's the difference between a pattern library and a style guide? And I say, again, those sort of 6 flavors of style guides, sort of serve as the umbrella, and a pattern library is a style, or is a flavor of a style guide. So how do we make these things happen, right? How do we establish pattern libraries with our work? Well, first thing, you sort of have to sell it, right? And you have to talk about the benefits of pattern libraries, right? The first and biggest one is it promotes UI consistency and cohesion, right? All that stuff that we talked about at the early stages of the presentation, right? Jacob Nielsen, right, came out and said, consistency is one of the most powerful usability principles, right? When things behave the same, users don't have to worry about what will happen. Instead, they know what will happen based on earlier experiences, right? And it's tremendously powerful. Leads to faster production. We interviewed Federico Holgado from MailChimp, and they have a really fantastic pattern library. And he talked about this notion of the dark corners of their site, right, of their app, right? Things like legal documents and status pages and stuff that isn't actually a priority. And he said that by establishing this style guide, this pattern library that they use the primary 4 screens of their app to establish, and then sort of used and reused those puzzle pieces they already established to light up those dark corners, right? Where so suddenly all of those things that, aren't exactly a priority suddenly have a first-class look and feel to them. It establishes a better workflow between everyone involved in the project, right? Last speakers were just talking about the importance of working together as designers and developers, and these pattern libraries definitely help establish this better workflow between designers and developers and business owners and all that, right? Creates a shared vocabulary between everyone in the organization, right? Lincoln Mongolo, who he used to work at Starbucks, and whenever they launched their new responsive site, they launched alongside it their new pattern library as well. He said that, that provided the common ground that the designers and the developers were really seeking, this ability to all sort of speak the same language, to call things the same names. It makes things easier to test, right? Lincoln again says, he says, you don't have to find every instance of a pattern, right? Instead, you could just sort of test that pattern in isolation and make sure that it's working well, right? And Marcy will talk later about accessibility. So you're able to test accessibility at the sort of pattern level, right? And Steve and Mark were just talking about performance. And so we could test the performance around a certain pattern and really hone in on that and optimize the performance around a specific pattern. Right? So again, you don't have to hunt down every instance of something to sort of find what your trouble spots are. It's a useful reference to keep coming back to over time, and it serves as this future-friendly foundation that you could live with and grow with and extend and learn from and test against and sort of roll those those learnings back into the living, breathing pattern library. So these things are awesome, and you could, tell that to your boss, tell that to your clients. It's like, hey, I really think we need to do that. And they'll go, that sounds expensive. No thanks, right? So this is where showing, not telling, is tremendously effective. Same way that web page test gives you those sort of, timelines and videos to really hit people over the head with. Right? The ability to take something like CSS stats, wherever you just sort of slap in your URL to that field and hit the go button, and it spits back all of your sort of CSS selectors, and you're able to go through and find the 45 unique colors that make up Facebook's web experience, and there are like 57 background images or whatever, or background colors. And you're able to sort of show this and to your organization, say, hey, maybe we should clean this up. Maybe there's something that we can do to make it so it's not so verbose. Another thing that I find tremendously helpful is what I call an interface inventory, right? If you're all familiar with this notion of a content inventory, you go through, you comb through your entire site looking for all your unique content types, and you're rounding up, what template it is, where it's going, who owns it, and stuff like that. Tedious process, but at the same time tremendously effective for establishing your scope of work as you redesign. Well, with an interface inventory, instead of rounding up different unique content types, you're rounding up unique interface patterns, right? Like our good friends at United, right? So here's the start of an interface inventory for them. So first things first, right? How do you actually conduct these interface inventories? Well, you got to get everybody in a room together. Does this look like your office? I hope so. But it does. It involves everybody. All your business partners, your UX designers, visual designers, front-end developers, back-end developers. Anybody that touches the website should be in a room together. And basically, you're going to do a screenshotting exercise. It's just been taking a ton of different screenshots. I made it just a little default template, like Google Slides template that you could chuck all your screenshots into. And then you actually go through and actually go through your interface and screenshot the hell out of your experience. Right? So you're looking for things like global elements like headers and footers, but different image types, heroes and avatars and icons, your hamburger buttons, your navigation like magnifying glasses and things like that, social buttons, different navigation types, different form types, different buttons, interactive components like carousels and accordions and tabs, different media types, audio, video, right? Different lists, third-party stuff, ad units, and stuff like that. And the whole idea is that you end up with this giant document, right, starting to cluster together, all of this maybe disparate crap, like this is my bank, right? That sort of looks like an issue, right? But by doing this exercise, you're able to really make the case that establishing a pattern library, establishing a sound design system is well worth your while, right? So going through and saying, here's our fields, here's our, all that, right? And then after that, once that's done, you present your findings and you start having a conversation about what you found during this exercise. So people could go, oh, I know why that's there, or oh, this is old and we could sort of, get rid of that thing or whatever. And again, at the end of this exercise, right, after doing this, you're able to merge all of those little sort of presentations into one Uber document, and then you put that in front of the CEO. Have you ever wanted to see your CEO cry? This is a great way to do that, right? But again, this just you don't need to be a designer to see 100 different button styles and go, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have that, right? So this helps, again, free up some budget, free up some time to make this a priority. And then lastly, it should be used as a conversation starter to, really sort of go back to that small interdisciplinary team that the last speakers talked about, right? To sort of establish the next steps and sort of translate that from just a thought experiment, from just an exercise, into a living, breathing style guide, right? This stuff goes, this can be merged into this, and we could kill this one, right? So you're documenting all of your UI, you're pointing out the inconsistency, you're getting buy-in from the organization as a result. It helps establish the scope of work for your project. It's that genesis of that shared vocabulary about like, what do we call this thing again, right? And it lays the groundwork for a future pattern library. And if the boss says no, then do it anyways. I firmly believe this. I'm very much a proponent of asking forgiveness, not permission. And this is especially true with establishing a pattern library or design system, because guess what? In order to make the new website or whatever it is your project is, you have to establish the parts of that whole anyways. You just might as well go, instead of this, right, which technically you can make some stuff with, right, out of a disheveled, box of Legos, right? But by taking just a little bit of time to organize those things, right, then you're able to do that work a lot more efficiently, right? It doesn't seem like rocket science, but boy, does it not happen as much as it should, right? So how do we actually create a sound UI design system, right? What does this actually look like? How can we create not just good final work, but also leave behind these great underlying UI design systems, right? And so that's sort of what I've been talking about for the last couple years. Again, 2 years ago at Beyond Teller in Dusseldorf was the first time I got to talk about this whole atomic design thing. Whenever I first talked about it, it was like, here's a sort of crazy idea. And now it's like, hey, it's been battle tested. People are actually using it, including myself. And it actually works. So I'm pretty happy about that. So what is atomic design? Well, 5 sort of distinct stages that all happen concurrently to help build, again, not just your final UIs, but also all the pieces that make up that final UI. So start with things like atoms, right? In nature, atoms are things like, hydrogen and oxygen, and they have their own unique properties, but they're sort of abstract, but they're the basic building blocks of all matter. Well, in our UIs, we have things like labels, inputs, buttons, right? Those are all the sort of elemental aspects of our user interfaces. But they're not terribly useful on their own. So at this molecule stage, what we're doing is we're taking those atoms and we're combining those together into a functional unit, in this case, like a search form molecule, right? Now suddenly that label atom is defining that input atom. Now all of a sudden, clicking on that button atom will submit the form, right? So now you have this nice little encapsulated piece of functionality that you could use wherever you need site search. So now we could take that search form molecule and put that into the context of a header organism, right? And that header organism might be comprised of a logo, primary navigation molecule, search form molecule, right? We see this on like every site we ever go to, right? You see these collections, relatively complex components that are all sort of functioning together as a unit, right? And it might be a bunch of disparate stuff, or it might be like the same sort of product item grid repeated over and over and over again, right? So now we have these relatively complex components, organisms. Now we put them into the context of something that looks like a page layout, right? And the big thing here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to establish the content structure of the page, right? This isn't the final stage, right? This is really exposing the sort of scaffolding, the skeleton that makes up that page, right? What's the size of that hero unit? How long are those headings, right? Stuff like that. And by establishing those rules and guidelines, you're able to sort of communicate better with the back-end team and the art directors and all those people. And then finally, at the page stage, what we're doing is we're taking that content skeleton, that template, and we're pouring real representative content into that template, right? And so obviously this is an important stage in the process because this is what your end users are going to see. This is what your client and your boss and stuff is going to sign off on. But it's also here that we're establishing, and validating or invalidating that underlying design system, right? What happens whenever you put all those Lego pieces together, right? Does it hold up whenever you put real content inside of it? Yes or no? And if it looks like crap, then guess what? You have to go back and solve that at a more atomic level. It's also at this page stage that we're able to articulate sort of differences in our templates, right? You might have a home page and a home page that says, hey, your account was hacked, right? And so having a big alert message across the top, and again, our design systems need to be capable and versatile enough to sort of handle all of those different scenarios. So that's atomic design. Again, these 5 stages, it's not a linear process. It's not like start with the buttons and end with the pages. No, this is all sort of happening at the same time. This is a mental model. And what I love about it is that it gives me the ability to sort of traverse between abstract and concrete. I'm able to say, okay, I need to, at one point in time, I need to be able to see everything put together. But at other points in time, I need to be able to see all of these bits and pieces blown out into their atomic elements and sort of step through how all of those atomic elements eventually make up the final UI. I've also found that clients don't give a shit about atoms and molecules and stuff. They're like, yeah, all right, that's cool. How much is that going to cost? All right. Fair enough. At the end of the day, they're commissioning you to make a website or something. So, they're going to hang out at the page level and stuff like that. But I've also found that it's tremendously helpful to still expose them to this. It's like, hey, we're not just creating you just another shiny new website. We're also creating this very deliberate, very thought through interface design system. And lastly, pages are there for review. Atoms aren't terribly helpful on their own. The real sort of construction process happens in those in-between stages. So that is the theory. That's the sort of methodology. That's the mental model that I've been using to create UI design systems. In order to actually bring this thing to life, I made a tool called Pattern Lab with a guy named Dave Olson back in the States. And what Pattern Lab is it's a way to sort of stitch together all of those atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages, right? It's a way to make these atomic design systems happen. It's an open source, like, static site generator tool, lives on your machine, and sort of stitches those things together, right? And it provides some other tools that I'll talk about in a bit, too. So, if you look at the atoms, by the way, this is what Pattern Lab looks like out of the box. It looks like shit. That's intentional, right? A big thing is like, Bootstrap and Foundation, and people are like, oh, what's the difference between Pattern Lab and Bootstrap? It's like, no. Like this doesn't give you any answers. You still have to do all the design and development work yourself. Pattern Lab isn't very opinionated. But we could go through and say, let's establish our color atoms, right? Like these very elemental aspects of our design. Here's our font stacks. Even invisible things like animation defaults, right? Headers, paragraphs, block quotes, inline text elements, right? Pre-formatted text, horizontal rules, lists, different image types. Here's our logo, hero images, avatars, right? Icons, spinners, fav icons, right? All that stuff, right? These are all elemental aspects of your experience. And again, you could pick and choose which ones you want, or if you need extra ones, you could add them or whatever. It's there for your customization. So, at the molecule stage, right, what we're doing inside a pattern lab is creating these relatively simple molecules, right, these relatively simple components. So this is a project we did for Time Inc., and this is one example of a molecule, right? And we're using Mustache, which is a logicless templating engine, to sort of help create this. So if you look at the HTML, we have some basic HTML, but then the orange bits are this mustache code, right? So we have a dynamic URL, we have a dynamic headline, and a dynamic excerpt. But the real sort of power comes with this little greater than sign, right? That's an include. So Pattern Lab is basically saying, hey, I want to include an atom called thumb, right? Which is that little guy, that 400 by 300 image. So then Pattern Lab's going to suck in that image. And now we have this little chunk of code that we could use that same greater than include pattern to include that little chunk of code elsewhere, right? Then at the organism level, if you take a look at something like a heading, right, this relatively complex component, and you look under the hood of that, you see, well, we got a header tag, and then again, it's just an include of the logo, an include of the primary navigation, and an include of the search form. And now again, using that same greater than sort of technique, we're able to include the header anywhere we need it, right? So you can sort of see where this is going. It's like Russian nesting dolls, right? Like little things are included in the bigger things, which are included in even bigger things. So now whenever you get up to the template level, right, like the homepage template, right, we're able to sort of see a page start to come together, right? So you'll see a few different patterns repeating themselves throughout the page, right, which are, again, just little includes of the same sort of patterns. And we're just sort of wrapping them in a name that we could latch onto later. And then at the page level, again, what we're doing is we're getting rid of that sort of grayscale, lorem ipsum text and stuff like that, and pouring in real, actual representative content. So here's our homepage template. And then at the page stage, what we're doing is pouring in pictures of Beyonce. If there's one thing I learned on this project, is that Beyonce is universally loved. So if you ever want to fast track your designs, irrespective of what industry you work in, what project you're working in, pictures of Beyonce. Enterprise intranet, pictures of Beyonce. Government website, pictures of Beyonce. Trust me on this. So you can see, we have our picture of Beyonce, we have an ice skater, we have real, actual sort of headlines here. And you could see that we're swapping out, instead of those grayscale images and stuff, we're actually pouring in real representative content. And we're doing that by sort of overriding some default data, using some JSON, and we're saying, here's our hero image source and hero_Beyonce.jpg. And that will sort of wipe out that grayscale image and swap in the picture we want. So, you can check out Pattern Lab. Again, it's open source. It's not really I'm not here to sell you on anything. But yeah, you could check it out and play with it. So, okay. We've been using this in our process to sort of go, much like Steve and Mark were just talking about, going from basic wireframes like this. This is as high fidelity of wireframes as we would use on our client projects. And we would jump straight into Pattern Lab. It could jump straight into code, roughing out these basic patterns, right? So this is a project we did for TechCrunch, a redesign of their site, and we were able to say, great, well, this is a publication, so they're gonna have things like block quotes and pull quotes and sort of basic patterns that we're gonna use throughout. And so we were able to go very quickly from these static sketches into the browser, right? Very early in the project. I'm talking like the first week of the project, right? Where this is what the homepage looked like after about the first week. Looks like garbage, but that's okay, right? And again, what we are able to do is get into the final environment faster, so we're testing things like performance, we're testing things like, usability, ergonomics, all those sort of invisible aspects of the design that you just don't get whenever you're working in static tools like Photoshop and Sketch, right? And from a visual design perspective, we are able to sort of take this same sort of modular approach, right? Dan Mall, who I got a chance to work with on these projects, uses what he calls element collages, which are basically, sort of style tiles, if you're familiar with this notion of like, here's some sort of exploratory color palettes and exploratory font, styles and things like that, and actually starting to apply those to an interface. But you could tell it's still, that's not a final finished website. It's not there for approval. It's there to have a conversation about, hey, you could start to see these things. Are we moving in the right direction? And then eventually we would latch on to a particular organism, typically like a header or something that's very visible. And we'd start having a play with that, and we'd show this to the client, have a conversation with it. All the while, I'd be there sort of in the background, putting this into Pattern Lab, putting this into code, and then we would do all of our iterations there, right? So Dan and I would work together. He's the visual designer working in tools like Photoshop, and I'm there working in HTML and Pattern Lab, and we'd be sort of moving together and sort of manipulating things in the browser. He'd be screenshotting things and sort of giving them back to me and stuff like that, right? So we'd end up in these sort of weird situations where we'd have part of the site styled and done, and then the rest of the page still looks like garbage. So it's really only at this stage in the game in our process that we actually started making comps. And I think out of this entire TechCrunch project, we only did like 4 full comps, right? Everything else was handled in Pattern Lab, handled in the browser, reusing those components, right? And that became our workflow, right? We are able to sort of take these comps, have conversations with the client, and once we got the basic, idea down, the basic direction down, then we're like, cool, we're going to take that, move that into the browser, and we'll do all of our tweaking there, right? So it became this really nice process wherever designers and developers were working closely together to come up with the final UI, but also leave behind and deliver to the client this final, finished, beautiful pattern library. And we handed it to the clients, and we're like, here you go. Goodbye, right? We've done our jobs. And they lived happily ever after. Or did they? As it turns out, making a pattern library, spending all this time being very thoughtful, being very deliberate with establishing a pattern library is like, oh, this is great. Yeah, I'm going to just chuck it in the trash can right next to the Photoshop documents and the PDFs. Thanks. So that's sort of depressing. So this is the issue. I think that this is the fundamental shift that we need to really take away here is that this is how we've been used to thinking about our work. We think, hey, we're designing and developing a website, right? And then we got this little style guide that's sort of hanging off the side that is like some documentation about that website, right? But you could sort of see what can happen here, right? It's just like, it's too much to maintain. It gets behind schedule, or you're busy with the next version of the site, and it's like, I don't have time to update the pattern library. And so it sort of dies on the vine or becomes obsolete very quickly. This is an issue. What I think needs to happen instead is this, right? Instead of thinking, and again, this is thinking and acting, right? Instead of thinking, we're making websites, we need to think, okay, we're making design systems that are making that website, right? The website is one instantiation of our design system, right? And that is a fundamental shift that I think really sets you up for long-term success because it injects that, it forces you to go through your design system in order to make updates and changes to your site, right? Nathan Curtis, who's done a lot of great thinking and writing on the topic, he says, a style guide is an artifact of the design process, where he says the design system is this living, funded project with a roadmap and backlog serving an ecosystem. So how do we actually make these things not just useful whenever we hand them off to our clients or get done with our sprint or whatever, but really make them long-term success stories? Well, we have to make it maintainable. There's this concept of the holy grail. And this is something that we're all sort of pursuing. Anybody that's been talking about pattern libraries is what we want to have this sort of magical setup wherever we have our pattern library of all of our Lego bricks that make up our final website. If we make a change to one of those Lego bricks, anywhere that Lego brick is included will just magically update, right? That is awesome. And very, very few people have actually made this come to life. Lonely Planet, Ian Feather and his team at the Lonely Planet have done exactly this, where they basically created their design system, they wrote an API for their pattern library, and then their production environment eats their pattern library, which is amazing. And what this allows them to do is crank out new pages, new features all the time, make tweaks, make performance tweaks, make accessibility tweaks, and those just roll out automatically to their production environment. It's amazing. Something I've been doing in my own workflow, as though it's not as hardcore as that, is just using Grunt to sort of, anytime I make a change to my CSS inside of Pattern Lab, it automatically bounces it over to my WordPress theme or whatever the production environment is. Anytime I make a change to my JavaScript, it bounces it over to my production environment. And the big trick, the big sort of challenge is finding the bridge between your patterns themselves, the actual markup, and the production environment's patterns, right? The production environment like includes or whatever. It's not impossible, but it definitely takes some thought and some setup, but it's well worth your time. How else could we make these things more long-term, long-term success stories? Make it cross-disciplinary, right? These things have the potential for being the watering hole that everyone gathers around to talk about, to facilitate that communication and collaboration that's so incredibly necessary to do good work, right? This is Walmart's website. We were just out in Portland, Oregon, hearing from their team about all that goes into making these hero units, and it's like hundreds of people and like hundreds of hours and all these meetings and all this stuff, right? So you have business owners with their own sort of concerns, you have project managers, product directors, art directors, UX designers, front-end developers, back-end developers, all with their own unique sort of, considerations and worries and all of that just for around that one component. So again, these pattern libraries create this hub that people can sort of gather around and have these conversations. In order to make it cross-disciplinary, they need to be attractive looking. And this sounds like a no-brainer, right? Well-designed things will get used more, right? So taking the time to create these good-looking, approachable style guides, right, lead to more people using them. They become more valuable. Make them more visible, right? Nathan Curtis says, a lot of times big organizations are like, oh my God, these are like our best-kept secrets, right? We need to keep this on lockdown behind some login, right? And he says, whenever you start doing that, right, they either, people don't get access to them, or it takes forever for them to get access, or they never get access at all. Back to the Starbucks style guide, they didn't have to release this thing to the public. They didn't have to put it at a publicly facing URL, but they did. And I'm so incredibly thankful they did, because that really did sort of set off an avalanche of other people starting to publish theirs. And this gets into something, I talk about with a lot of things, is like giving stuff away or giving away your secrets and all of that. And a lot of those concerns are just totally unjustified. And whenever Anna and I started interviewing people for our podcast about style guides, every single guest came back to this notion that their style guide served as a huge recruitment tool. Right? Gina Bolton, who's like one of the most amazing SaaS developers on the planet, saw Salesforce's style guide and was like, I need to work there, right? And now they've done all this great like lightning design system stuff, and it's like, holy shit, right? Talk about worth their while. Make these things agnostic, right? It's hard to sort of, get out of the context whenever you say, oh, like that's a product item or something like that. It's really easy to sort of get tunnel vision on where our UIs get used, but it's more helpful and creates more versatile, more versatile patterns by naming things very generically, right? Things like feature block and stuff like that. This is tough. Like, as you all know, if you've ever tried naming a Photoshop document or CSS nomenclature or anything like that, naming things is tremendously difficult. So what I found to be really helpful is sort of take a component and sort of blur out the actual contents of that thing, right? And then say, what is that, right? So that's like a helpful exercise to help you focus on the sort of structural elements rather than the content that goes inside it. Make it contextual. Show what patterns make up a specific pattern, right? Show where that pattern gets used, right? By just sort of showing, this little piece of interface, it's like, well, that's great, but like, where is this thing actually being used? With Pattern Lab, because we have that sort of Russian nesting doll approach, we could actually track where each pattern gets used, which makes it really, really helpful to go back through. If you were to make a change to that pattern, you could go, oh, okay, I now need to retest the profile nav, the section media list, the account settings, and the account edit settings to make sure nothing broke, right? That's hugely helpful. And then lastly, make it last, right? This is not a one and done thing. This is not just a static artifact, right? This should be a living, breathing entity. I think things like Material Design are really fantastic and fascinating because they publish these updates. It's like, here's what changed, right? Here, we added this thing, or we removed this, or we tweaked this thing. And that sort of helps keep people in the loop. It helps keep people interested and sort of reaffirms that, like, yeah, we're behind this project. Yes, this is still active. Oh, by the way, have you used it today, right? Marriott, their digital team, they have this wonderful monthly newsletter that basically goes through the same stuff. Here's what changed, here's what we added, here's what just got launched with it, and stuff like that. It's really fantastic. I like to joke around, like pattern libraries, these design systems are like a fine wine, right? They increase in value as time goes on, right? The more you make it part of your workflow, the more you make it work for you, the more it's going to pay off dividends in the long run, right? So very much worth your while to set it up initially, and even more worth your while to make sure that it stays relevant, stays a core part of your workflow. And if you do all these things, you'll end up... This could be you. I spent too much time on Getty Images, and I ended up buying this video. And it wasn't cheap, but, I'm using it. It's so incredibly awkward. So, oh my God. Please go make great pattern libraries. If you're interested about this, I'm writing a book on the topic. I'm writing it in the open. If you want to pre-order the ebook, hey, it's only $10, so give me money. Sorry. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.